Hi everybody, I'm Robin here from Birchal and I'm joined by Charbel, who is the founder of Alt Saints, which is a remarkable business actually. When we first initially started speaking about the Alt Saints, there's just so much depth to this business that it's actually so interesting to really learn more about the business and understand really where the founders are coming from, what journey you've been on to get here, because it's literally been a almost 20-year startup journey for you to kind of get to this stage. Not a journey with Alt Saints itself, but a 20-year background and experience that you've got here. So if everybody can hear us okay, then please, no news is good news, I guess, in that regard. But if there's any sound issues at any point in time, please do use the chat feature to mention it at any point in time. And as well as this, throughout the whole presentation that Charbel is going to be going through, I really want to just highlight the Q&A feature here, which you can click on, ask any questions, and we will be taking these throughout the webinar so that you don't have to wait until the very end to receive them. So without me going into too much more detail, I know that everybody is here to learn more about Alt Saints and hear from you, Charbel. So I'm going to hand things over to yourself.
Thank you so much, Robin. Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining. It's still kind of weird because I'm sure we're all used to video chats. That looks like Brady Bunch, and all I can see is Robin right now and my screen. So, yeah, thanks for taking the time to be here today, and also for your expression of interest. It's been a massive journey to get here, as Robin said. Rob's joined, Rob Price, hello. And where I'm at right now is at a pretty very, very interesting sort of juncture in life and also with the business. So earlier this year, I'd put together an investment pitch deck to head over to the United States to pitch it there. I had quite a few meetings with potential investors lined up, and as February started to draw out closer to March, we saw what was going on with COVID around the world, particularly in Europe. So I pulled that plan really, really early, and luckily 2 weeks later we went into lockdown. So that hasn't stopped me from progressing the brand and the brand family. In fact, if anything, it's helped me sort of evolve it to another level. So let me just start. So here we are. Here, yeah. So I won't read everything. I won't bore you with that. But welcome. I'm Charbel. I'll go straight into where I'm at and what I've done. I've been in design and tech for 22 years and in the food industry for about 30 years. And over that time, I've amassed a lot of experience and a lot of skills in there. Probably the more interesting one recently was I exited from my last company last year. It was around last October. It was October, in fact. That was an education company I set up originally in 2014. Took on a co-founder a year later. Then went through quite a few, 3 rounds of investment. First being seed. We got approached in that, and over the few years before I decided to exit, we raised about just over $5.7 million. Company's still going, which is great. And at my last exit, it was valued around about 20 mil, which is kind of cool. But I just wanted to get out and do some other things. Other successes, Time Out, top 5 cafes in Sydney. I know a couple of people here who I can see who are saying hello, who've been to the cafe. They know what that was all about. It went from being a little idea to do some food service products into a full-blown cafe, just because of people knocking on the door and asking for coffee. So that was a great journey. And a lot of the growth there was using social media when Twitter was a tool that really did precede things like Facebook and Instagram. There were a lot of people who were quite influential in the food scene who discovered the cafe. And Miffy Sully was one of them, who I didn't even know until after about 4 visits. She was the food editor for Time Out. Where am I? Sorry, here we are. So what we've got, I'm going to go through the challenges that we're facing globally, and this isn't news for most people now. We're looking at some very, very complicated ecological challenges. Now, as a brand, what I've done and what I've created is these 4 brands, each with a focus, and simplifying it to beasts, trees, bees, and seas. Now, storytelling is a really important part for me and for the brand itself, and you'll see as we progress through this the importance of storytelling in this, and how the engagement is not just the food and not just the design, not just the package, but it's also around how we tell stories and how we communicate the brand and the purpose in a very non-judgmental and non-dramatic way. So, and that's where it goes. And again, this is no secret if you're following any of the media. It's interesting right now because, you know, COVID has really taken the attention away from the world with what's happening at a climate level. But from an animal perspective, you know, we're talking about the 6th mass extinction, and at this stage, we're losing thousands of species of animals a year. If you look at the jungles, the native forests, they're being cleared quite substantially when you look around the world. And for the most part, it's for cattle production and for the expansion of the human race. The insects, you know, there's the talk of the insect apocalypse, and there's been a lot of articles over the last couple of years talking about how bees are absolutely critical to our food supply. And without it, if we don't do something about it, we're putting more and more pressure on the food supply, and particularly as our population grows. And also now that we're looking at the oceans and we talk about microplastics, pollution, all that sort of, all the problems that are really front and center and quite immediate that we need to solve. What we've got to understand is that there's no one way that we can look at a single problem without uncovering more problems. So everything is linked, and it feels more and more urgent. And there's varying reports. You know, a lot of scientists are saying that we've only got a number of years before we start to see systemic collapses, which is terrifying. And we're starting to see in Canada, they've lost the last of the Arctic ice sheets this week. Again, what that will do, we'll see in a few months' time what sort of effect that will have. And this is where I introduced the alt saints. So we've got Frankie, Dottie, Buzz, and Estelle. Very much a purpose-driven family, and they're actually based on actual saints. You know, I did grow up Catholic, and the saints do have the Catholics do have a saint for everything, and it became a really interesting way to start pinning sort of a character face on top of the problems that we're facing, but also looking at what purposes they've all got. So each of them has a specific purpose, and each of them has a specific category that they're choosing. And I've chosen 4 main sort of groups of food products to associate with these saints, you know, Frankie, Dottie, Buzz, and Estelle, for a number of reasons. One is, you know, because they're massively lucrative categories. The other part is that they're scalable and repeatable in various markets. And when we do move down towards the retail level, the training requirements to bring people in, to train them and to create those sort of systems that anybody with a minimal set of skills can come in. So that's the reason why we're doing it. And I'll show you the figures later on around what the market actually does look like. You know, one of the biggest premise that we've got going on here is that people are buying better versions of themselves. And there's a lot of data that's showing this as being absolutely evident. You know, people are expecting that companies start to do something. People want to feel that by making a purchasing decision, they're making an impact. The sustainability angle is really, really interesting because, you know, from Unilever's perspective, they're positioning themselves more and more as a sustainable brand group. And, you know, for instance, not Tom and Jerry's, that's a cartoon, Ben and Jerry's and Dove are 2 of their flagship brands. They are, since they switched to a sustainable model, their revenue has increased in comparison to the other brands within that group by 75% per annum. So we're looking at really massive shifts in conscious consumerism. And then when we're starting to see that people are willing to pay that little bit more for something that is on purpose, that is good quality, and that matches their own sort of value system. And, you know, the brands themselves, they are going to be completely plant-based. And there's a reason for it. I mean, ecological reasons aside, it's starting to make a lot of business sense because we're seeing massive growth around the world from people shifting towards plant-based diets. And we're seeing even more of it now due to COVID. Again, I think tofu sales went up by 8,000% in the UK during lockdown, something recently, which is phenomenal. And so that's where it's a really important bit. So each of the brands, as I was saying before, has got a category, and they've got different levels of maturity right now. So the cereals are already selling. So it's very much an MVP product, but selling online and getting a lot of repeat business, which is great. And then the feedback, for the most part, has been amazing around the quality of the product, the design, the messaging as well. And interestingly, it is hitting the mark with kids, because I don't have a label right with me, but from the granola perspective, the label's got the animal in there with a number above it, which basically tells them how many of these animals are left in the wild. So the kids get really excited. They see the character because it's a really relatable design. Then they read, they ask the question, what's the number? And I've seen this a few times now. And there's a little message on the side that says there's only, if I look at the Cross River gorilla, there's only 100 Cross River gorillas left in the wild. The kids get really sad. And then when they see at the bottom strip that 10% of revenue goes towards saving these animals, they feel really hopeful. And it's not a trick, it's just like it's genuine integrating the purpose in there. So the next thing, and this all depends on what sort of raise we get at this stage of the company. So we've already launched with the granolas, and we'll be refining the packaging and compliance around retail. But then the next one, as soon as we can off the bat, will be the alternative milks, because again, they're a growing category. And I don't know if you guys have been following the news recently. I think it was like 3 weeks ago, a group in America that included Jay-Z, Oprah, and Natalie Portman bought a 10% stake in Oatly. Oatly is a Swedish brand that's been around for about 20 years, doing oat milk. And so that put the value of that company at $2 billion, just with that that sort of investment. And you can see what people are starting to see. So this growth in plant-based eating is not going to stop, and people are looking for these sort of things. So who knows where we can go with this? And then the next thing will be the coffee in a can. So again, that's been massive in Japan for quite a while, and we're starting to see some changes in that sort of thing in Australia as well, which is really cool. So again, from a design perspective, it matters. From a content, in terms of the content, the ingredients, high quality, really tasty, and then purpose thread throughout the product. St. Dottie, donuts and tea, so massive categories. This is all, anything from Saint Frankie is still in its infancy and still in its concept mode, but that's where we're going. So St. Bar's is going to be juices and salads, as well as things like plant-based proteins. Again, big markets. And again, when I think about this and why we're doing it this way, is because of being able to take advantage of contract manufacturing relationships, which I'll talk about in a second. St. Estella's, we're looking at how do we already started experimenting with ice creams right now. Plant-based, I've been making my own, which is a chocolate one, which is amazing, but it doesn't have much of a stable shelf life. So it's great for home, but that's the beginning of what we're looking at with plant-based. So the choices with the brands and also the direction with the product being two things, one that goes on the shelf and one that goes in the actual stores, is looking at what are the lowest costs to set up, as well as the highest margins. So starting with Saint Frankie, there's a reason for that. One is because from a brand perspective, there's a much more of an emotional connection to animals. So that's working. So we start with that, and being all shelf products, the idea is to establish those distribution and retail relationships now with the brand, and to build up that sort of the relationship model. And then over time, as we start to build the revenue for Saint Frankie, the idea is to look at how do we create little pop-ups and little test markets to launch the other brands at really low cost. I'm looking at a space in Botany at the moment, which I'm hoping I'll get the lease for today, which is amazing because it's a quasi-production space, but it's also got this massive warehouse at the back, which is going to be great for retail. Botany is a growing area, and that will be the great place for us to start testing things like interesting tea mixes, grape juices, etc. And so by doing it that way, is that we start to build mindshare, and ignore phase 2 of Saint Frankie yet. But as we start to build, to establish those sort of retail and distribution partnerships, over time, that gives us the door into for the other brands to start selling any shelf-ready items that would work at a retail level. And I don't know if you guys have followed the story of Nutty Juices. That's been an amazing one because that was they've been around Australia for quite a while. They got to about $100 million of revenue with a fresh product, which was and that was a brand new brand, borrowed heavily from Innocent in the UK. But it was a really interesting model for them, having that distribution play to get a fresh product out into the supermarkets. And they did really, really well until they did some dodgy things, but we won't go into there right now. So as I mentioned before, there's different states of readiness for the brands. The cereals are quite evolved, and it's just a matter of saying, yes, we're going to go into production with proper production. I've got two contract manufacturers in Melbourne who I'm speaking with. I've been speaking with one of them for about 8 months now. So with that basically means unit economics is massively favourable. So going from small batch handmade, we're not getting any of the economies of scale. As soon as we go to that production, the price per kilo is almost eye-watering. You'll see what sort of margins there are in that. Alternative milks, I was trialling a lot of them in Vietnam. I was in October last year, and I've got quite a few contacts there now. Some amazing product, and trying to go for a higher nut milk content because a lot of the more prominent brands in Australia have got almond milk down to like 1.3% content, which is ridiculous. It's mostly water. The product did test well, and I'm not 100% sure that Vietnam's going to be the best option. And the reason why I went with Vietnam is because of the trade relationship they have with USA, and that was when my intention was to start this over in the USA. And the ready-to-drink coffee is just concepts, and so everything else. The hats are quite well evolved. I'm wearing one now. I wear this every day. Books, there's a heap of content that I've already written. So it's a big extensible brand. So I want to talk about the opportunity. It's massive. Like the categories themselves, when you look at the global market size and you bring it down to the APAC level, and then also down to the Australian level, at the top, when you look at the bubbles there, that's effectively what the market looks like right now. And some data we can't get, things around like salad bars, etc., isn't really available here. But even just taking that out and just focusing on what available data we have, when you look at what is possible in the APAC space at a conservative level, 0.1%, 0.5%, etc., and then when you bring it down to the Australian level, which is the bottom row of bubbles there, we're looking at a pretty impressive market size. And I've got a couple of case studies I'll talk to in a second, but one of the more impressive ones, a local brand, which is still an independent one, is Carmen's Muesli. Now they, as a company, pre-COVID, they were generating $105 million in annual revenue. When COVID hit, their revenue went up by 50%. Obviously because people were at home, they weren't grabbing their breakfast on the way into work. So, we've got a big market effectively that we're playing with. Here's the case study. So I mentioned before, we've got Oatly as an interesting benchmark for us. They have been around for a while. They're from Sweden at a $2 billion valuation. It's pretty impressive with effectively only 3 products. So part of that investment, or the purchase, was to start expanding their production facilities. They will start expanding their product range. And their brand approach is really cool. Like, it's quite cheeky. It's quite irreverent. Doesn't suit what Old Saints is all about. But it is a good branding approach. And here, I just mentioned Carmen's just now. So one of the interesting things is with Carmen's is that they don't have their own production facility. They've got 6 contract manufacturers that make 82 of their products. And so they've got 5,000 stores here and abroad. They made a good inroad into China. They were in a lot of it on Qantas in particular, were stocking their products. Obviously, that's not a business revenue stream for them right now. But when you look at, I didn't finish the Boost Juices one. So at a nutshell, the $2 billion figure is quite right. So that's how much revenue they've made since its inception. So Boost has been going since I think it was 1990 or 91, and now they're a franchise model, but they've generated $2 billion in revenue over the 20 years. So it's pretty impressive, $100 million over that time. Where am I now? So I did this when I was heading over to the States, just like pulling out the market, and I'm not going to go through every single one of them here with you, but what's interesting, I can't, oh, sorry, here we are. If you can see that, the sweet greens under the salads, that was a really interesting company for me to pay attention to, because traditionally all the other companies that you see here are food and food service companies. Now, what Sweetgreens did was position themselves as a tech company. They're still food, but it's a tech company, and they've gone through, similar with what I'm doing right now, through a series of raises. And they did Series C last year, where they raised $158 million in US at Series C, which put them at a valuation of $1.6 billion. So they've got 75 to 80 stores, and I know that they've taken a hit during COVID. But the interesting part of that is the approach to treat Sweetgreens as a tech company rather than food. I mean, Domino's positioned themselves that way as well a few years ago, and they really have embraced technology as a way. And that's a massive difference for me compared to all the other brands, of how they've been able to use technology from a loyalty membership perspective, ordering, all that sort of, and all the things that those of us who are in the tech game would now expect companies to do, but they've done it the best. And I particularly like their approach. I've had a few questions. I've got windows here. Sorry guys, I've lost my mouse. I can't move this window out of my, can you give me 1 second? The mouse is there. There we are. So, so here we are. So how's the money going to be spent? Like really, about half of it will go into operations, and that's really important for me right now. Revenue is one thing, sales and revenue, brand building is another thing. But the brand itself, the family itself, is quite ambitious, and it's about establishing the core team, the systems, the processes, the network, the distribution network, which is, it's about getting some agreement with retailers and those distributors. Creating the experience, that's a small slice, but for me, coming from a branding and a customer experience background, brand and experience are really, really critical to this whole brand. And also investing in product, which is development, creating stock, having enough in there, because right now it's very, very much hands-on, and the scalability of the mode right now is pretty much non-existent. So putting money into product, and as we all know, sales and marketing are going to be really critical for this, which we've started some marketing and deliberately not done a lot of marketing because, again, not being able to cope with a volume of orders. So right now we're sitting at quite a few orders, which is hard work, but the idea is to make it less hard work in fulfilling those orders. From a current status perspective, it's, as I mentioned before, Frankie is the most evolved out of all of the brands. There's a lot of content. The product is very, very well developed. The online store, even though it's an Alt Saints store, has a real focus on Saint Frankie right now. And in terms of physical retail locations, like I've been looking at a space in Botany, as I mentioned before, which will become the first sort of test ground. It's really, really cheap, and it's great space and a great location that is starting to murmur. Like, I don't know if you guys saw my social media posts. I've got Manu Fieldell, he's on the My Kitchen Rules show. He's chipping in some coin, which is great, and he's also going to become a brand ambassador. So his place is literally going to be around the corner from where I'm looking at, and also a lot of emerging businesses are there right now. Indicative timeline. So it's really hard to pin this one down right now because the thing is that I'm treating investment as one thing and the intent to develop the brand as another thing, because I'm doing it anyway. And so the investment will shorten a lot of the timelines and allow me to go in and do a test with a whole lot of the other brands. So obviously starting with Frankie, the next logical one, depending on the space right now, will probably probably be to do a juice bar at a botany, because there's a lot of people who are actually buying lunches there. Right next door is a place called Son of a Baker, and I was stunned to see how many people were there during the week buying a coffee and buying a pastry. So Buzz is probably the next logical one. Dottie's very easy to do from a tea perspective as well. So again, depending on what sort of how the investment goes, the investment run through Birchal now goes, some of these timelines might become compressed. And I've had a couple of questions from people who've seen the Birchal campaign asking why Saint Estelle, which is ice cream, will be the last to launch. That's probably the most capital intensive brand from an equipment perspective to do. And the other interesting thing right through this is that the intra-brand relationships are pretty high. So because Estelle's brand is all about plant-based ice creams, the logical input is going to be the alternative milks from Frankie. So we're doing intra-brand relationships through there. So we'll start to see more and more of that later. Another question I had was around the fund. And I won't spend too much time on this because this is the intention of what the fund's going to be. And for us to get a deductible gift recipient status through ASIC it's not that complicated a process, but it's an administrative overload right now, which, like, as a company this small, even post investment, I wouldn't commit to doing a proper fund for at least until we hit $2 million revenue, or at least a year, whichever one happens first, because there's people who've got to be involved in administer the fund. There's a lot of auditing and compliance requirements from this. And I like the idea right now, but it's just too much too soon. So the way that we'll do the distribution of that commitment is going to be pretty manual, and establishing relationships with like Wires, Taronga Zoo. I've been speaking with them as well. I know quite a few people there. So the DGR status is going to wait for a little while, but this is the intention. So over time is how do we actually invest in people who startups and tech solutions. So 70% goes to the eco initiatives. That's in the future when the fund gets established. And then 25% will go towards startups who are solving environmental challenges, whether it's through technology or awareness, whatever that might be. And this is the interesting question, interesting thing around the fund itself, because I don't know if you guys have been seeing a lot of the posts that anti-Bill Gates and anti-Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, because the foundation can actually become profitable in itself. I have every intention of doing similar things, because the whole idea is that is the fund itself. When you start to, if we're putting money into the fund from the Alt Saints, then the fund as a DGR, we get a tax benefit from it. DGR then distributes the funds to other not-for-profits with DGR status. That also becomes a tax benefit. So the idea is that the money comes back into the organisation or into the fund, and then we reinvest it as a way to grow, particularly grow the fund. And Rob, who's on this call today, Rob, he is very, very well aware of the fact that a fund has to have a business-like approach. It can't just be a do good thing. It's got to do well in and of itself, and that's important. So I've been talking for 35 minutes. I'm sorry, guys. So why is...
So I'm sorry to interrupt there. I just thought, actually, at this point in time where you've reached the end of the fund, we've just got a question here from Asim, who's very much so complimenting your deck and is really intrigued to find out what is driving you in the development of the business, kind of hearing some ecological and educational motivations coming through, but what's really driving you to create this business? So I think it's a really good question, actually, because there is so much purpose here. So I'd really love to just hit the answer live button and to hear your answer here.
Go for it. Yeah, thank you. Sorry, I didn't catch the name of
Asim.
Hi, Asim. Thank you for that question. So what's driving me with this is, it was funny, when I decided to exit from my last company, I was pushed on garden leave, which was a brutal thing to do to somebody who's used to working every hour given. But it worked out quite well for me, because it was during summer, I was at the beach. And what I was doing is reading a lot. And because I'd kind of seen some of the challenges that we're facing around the environmental challenges and the animal welfare challenges. So during that time, I did a lot of reading, and I didn't really pay, up until then, attention to how complicated these challenges are. And if you guys want to watch a movie, I thoroughly recommend. It's called Sea of Shadows. It's like an eco documentary thriller, and that's based in the Gulf of California and Mexico. What that highlighted for me was the illegal animal trade, and the links between illegal drug trade, human trafficking, and how complicated the corruption, government level corruption, how complicated and how involved these challenges are. And for me, it was just like, well, where are we? Like, what are we as human beings? Because everything I'd been doing before has pretty much been purpose driven. This one felt, when I started to realize what was going on and where the world was headed, it was, you got two camps: people who are climate deniers and people who actually pay attention to the science and to the research. For me, what was driving me was like, what sort of world are we going to create in the next 10 years? For ourselves, but also for the generation that goes beyond us. So we've inherited a bit of a mess, but the kids of now are inheriting a massive mess. So for me, it was really important to think about what is it that I'm going to do at a personal level, rather than sitting there sharing stuff on social media, which doesn't really do much, just angers people. Protesting is great. That works. It brings awareness, but it's not me. So how do I create my own protest in something that I want to create, which is a business? So this is my way of protesting effectively, in a very non-threatening, non-angry, and non-judgmental way. Because if you look at the Saint Frankie site, there is no finger pointing anywhere, and that's not the way to solve problems. The problem is, okay, here's a problem. What are we going to do about it? So that's the brand positioning. Does that answer your question?
Well, I absolutely hope so. I think it's a very detailed response, but I think, I'd love Asim to follow up with another question if that perhaps didn't answer the exact specific nature of what they really wanted to get at. And we've got a couple more questions, but I'd love you to perhaps go through a couple more slides before we do attend to those.
So there's a lot of reasons to invest, and for a lot of things, it's the product itself is great, high quality products, purpose is high, the potential is massive at a market level, and the brand extensibility for me is even bigger than food. So it goes beyond just a food brand. And when I say just, I'm not being dismissive. The opportunity here to go into mixed reality experiences, content publishing. I did an interview this week on Ausbiz, or last week rather, and the host very cleverly said, I can't wait to see the kids' TV show, which is exactly the intention of where I want to go with this. And it has all the markings for collaboration with other brands. Interestingly, because I've already had a few people approach me, talk about collaborations too soon, but I've got some ideas around there. And a few people have reached out to me directly and asked me what are the likely exit scenarios for this, for these brands. And there's three actually. One is that we just continue until life goes on, and that's probably what I want to do, because I'm not as young as you, some of you folk. But that's not the reason why. But acquisition is done right, and there's a lot of work to do before this becomes a real thing. You see a lot of the major food brands who are still actively acquiring, even through COVID, particularly in America and Europe. I was reading yesterday, the Ferrero Rocher family in Italy. They're the wealthiest family in Italy, and they've turned up the notch on acquisitions right now in the food space. I mentioned Unilever before. They're always looking for purpose-driven companies to acquire. But again, we've got to prove the model and got to make it scalable, make it repeatable. So there's a lot of work to do in there. IPO is another likely scenario. That requires a lot of work to be done ahead of time, particularly with in Australia to be listed on the ASX. is a lot of work. It'll be at least 3 years before we can even start the preparation for that, because we've got have to show a lot of history, and the company systems, the processes, the auditing has to be in place before we even start to go to think about what ASX to actually be considered for listing by the ASX. And personally, I wouldn't want, my last company had an investor wanting to push us to IPO really quickly, and I said absolutely not. Like, we'd get decimated on the stock exchange, because you want to show profitability to be able to list, and then once you are listed, there's a lot more auditing and reporting requirements that basically requires a different sort of team structure to progress that way. Now, here's the premise. There you go. That's it for me for now. I've got a massive appendix in there, which, if there's other questions that people have, I might have already addressed it in there. So, yeah, thank you.
Perfect. Perfect. We've got a few more questions actually, and I've even dug up some from your discussion feed, but also some from our online system, which obviously always come our way as well. And we've just got one at the top here from Karen, who's asking about the storefronts, saying, looking at the storefronts for each of the 4 individual brands within the Alt Saints, for some or all of them, would you ever consider looking at a franchise model like Boost?
Potentially, like that again, that for me, I would treat that the same way as I would treat any sort of IPO or ASX listing. I would want to make sure that we've got systems so tight and so refined that it can be repeatable and scalable and manageable. Because franchising is a great model. There's no question that it's a great model, and it's a great way for a company to build its own wealth. So it's an absolute consideration, and I think there's that's in the future that can possibly be something, because again, when you look at all those sort of food categories, all 4 of them, the reason for them is they're great categories. They are exciting. They're largely under-innovated categories, and the beauty is the gross margins are huge on them. The repeatability of them all are great. Most of it can be relied on with contract manufacturing, and the training requirements are really, really simple. So thanks, Karen. I think it's an awesome idea, and it is definitely one that is in the thought bubble to consider, because Boost has done a phenomenal job of creating a really great franchise. And again, when you go to any Boost store, and it's pretty much the same product, effectively.
Absolutely, absolutely. And now there's been a few questions around that, and to be honest with you, there's so many considerations for a business like yours to go down the franchisee route or to keep everything under control, and you really have to weigh up options when you get there. So keeping both options on the table is probably a pretty sensible decision for a business like yours. And the remaining, we've got 4 questions which are actually open in the Q&A field, and if anybody has any other questions, please do go ahead and feel free to ask them here. I think that this is quite a clear question, and we've had a couple around this as well, which is really the 10%, which goes 10% of revenue, which ends up obviously going to the Alt Saints Fund. And Owen here has asked if there is a policy on the distribution of environmental funds if Alt Saints doesn't make enough profit to cover the cost of 10% of revenue. And mentioned that this is a potential issue that Patagonia has faced with their 1%, commitment to the planet for good, which we know a company like Patagonia has gone through.
Yeah, and that's a fair and valid question. Right now, without the big structural costs that we'd have as a tiny company, as the company grows and the structural costs become higher, that becomes a concern. And again, it would be hoping that the positioning of being supportive of organisations that are doing the work becomes the purpose in itself. I'm hoping right now that the number is something for now, and one that we would probably have to play with into the future if that becomes an issue. So again, right now, because structurally it's really small, it's manageable. But again, if we start to build an admin team and a much more complicated operational team, that will become an issue.
Yeah,
That
sure.
one would address.
What was that? Sorry.
One that would have to be addressed.
Yeah, of course, of course. And I think in addressing that, do you have any, because we've had a couple of questions here kind of below around the same point. Have you gone down the route of further addressing a policy in place to say if we don't hit this revenue figure, then ultimately we're going to have to cut this 10% commitment? Obviously, you want to stay true to your customers, so
Yeah.
it's going to be quite difficult to predict. But
Mm.
is there something in place which perhaps you do have?
Yeah, it's just more of a discussion now. Like, that's really what it is. Like, there's not a firm policy in there. It's one that is probably worth committing to. Actually, thank you for that. And that's one I will address this week as
Yeah.
a as a formal thing.
Yeah, and Joey has asked a similar question around, can you switch it to 10% of profit instead of 10% of revenue? And we've had this conversation at the very beginning, and they've kind of asked, saying, if you start by naturally running the business at a loss, giving away another 10% would be costly. We've had this conversation around this, and I think, in making comparisons to giving away profits versus revenue, and the reason why you've gone down that route would be a really good way to address this question.
Yeah, so that's a good. It's a very good one. Now, profit is an interesting space because it's easy to play with profit by issuing bonuses, boosting the expenses, that sort of thing. And I've seen a lot of companies who commit profit, even 100% profit, get into a lot of trouble because they have done clever things with books. I do like the profit mode, because when I started this company, it was interesting because I was committing to profit, and then as I started to see some of the pitfalls of going down the profit path, from a brand perspective, it can be quite damaging if anything comes up that doesn't that could hint at playing with your books to reduce your profits. So that's a really good question, and I am going to chat with Robin this one offline afterwards. It's a good one. That's a good one, and one I'd love to hear from anyone who is looking at potentially investing to see. I'd love to gauge what is the right number and mode, whether it's sales or whether it's from revenue or from profit. I'd love to gauge that, because the market research is great from a customer's perspective, because they go, great. But it's also the purpose works. So it's almost like, I don't want to play games with it, but I would love to hear from any of the potential investors to actually gauge what's the right, what is that right range, and is it from profit or is it from revenue?
Absolutely, and I think you couldn't be more right on the idea of asking your investors and people who want to come in. Here, sorry, I'm just getting a couple of questions here from Matthew, who's suggesting that he can't see anybody on the screen. Unfortunately, I don't know how we can potentially rectify that if anybody else is having any issues, because it does look like it's functioning correctly. But please do let us know if anybody else is having issues with seeing us on the screen. Here, I can blow this one up. If we swap the shared screen with the video, we can do it that way. So I'll just go ahead and try to do this. So then everybody should be able to see us. In fact, hopefully that should have fixed it. But yeah, we'll see. I was going to say, and I'm really sorry to hound you on this question, Charbel, but Asim here has asked around how you've landed on the 10% revenue. Thanks very much, Matt, for confirming that it's now fixed. How do you land on 10% revenue towards your purpose? And also, would this be subject to change up or change down based on what criteria? We've kind of covered this. Do you care more about profit or purpose? And I think that this is a question which I'd even like to address, actually, having come from the UK and coming over to Australia and working with so many businesses. I used to work in the same industry here. really centered around raising funds for early stage businesses. And businesses in Australia have a much more purpose driven approach to the way they do business. And I think it really comes around doing good and being a good person, and the idea of running a business for the right reasons and that business existing for the long term. And I think the for profit, for purpose model works much better in a country like Australia because people are more concerned about what they can do to actually help one another. So I don't want to take away the answer from you though, Charbel. Please do go ahead.
I agree with you completely. It is a mix of profit and purpose. Again, when we look at Unilever as an example, they are very much purpose driven, and it's taken them a few years to get there. But they have gotten there, and they've proven with a lot of their brands that they're pushing towards sustainability that people actually care for it. So it's actually driving revenue, it's driving sales.
Yeah.
And the stats are there. Like, the data is there that people genuinely want to align with brands that are aligned with their own value systems. So both, absolutely both are important. For me, it's when I think about driving a company, it's like it was the same thing I used to get in the customer experience space, where people would champion the user, champion the customer, and say, great, but if without a profitable business, you don't have a customer. So which one is the most important thing? It's the same with purpose and profit. So it can become 100% purpose driven and rely just on goodwill if that's possible. But profit for growth, for scale, and for returns is really important as well.
Yeah, fantastic. Here, I'll just tick that one off. We've got a question here from Nikau, and I'm really sorry if I haven't pronounced that correctly, who really loves the presentation and is keen to understand a bit more that, you've mentioned going into Australia and APAC as primary rollout territories.
Yeah.
And is wondering if in the next 5 years, the USA is a potential market that you might look to crack.
Oh, absolutely. It's an amazing market. Funnily enough, I got a LinkedIn invitation from an investor over in the US who's based in the Bay Area. And he's keen. He's very keen to chat when America opens up, when we can go to America again to see. But really right now it's about establishing Australia first, getting our operations and the brand together, and actually playing with the things that are causing people concern, like the 10%. But it's also about what is the most likely next step to go. America's a massive market, and in the figures, it's a pretty impressive market as well when we look at that. And more Americans are moving towards purpose-driven companies. So USA is definitely there. And again, the beginning of this was, my intention was to move over to America and to set up over there.
Yeah.
So thank you.
Fantastic. And, I'll just tick that one over as well to the answered section. And then we'll answer the next one, which is from Asim again. So given the brand architecture and all the possibilities for extensibility and expansion into various areas, how do you navigate the terrain here? How do you decide where your focus and investment goes? I think there is a huge roadmap here for the business and its growth and where you are going. But I really love the way that the current status of each individual business has mapped this out, and how it's really navigated what progress you've made with each individual brand.
Thank you. So to answer that question, that's Asim's question?
That's Asim's question, correct.
So the brand architecture, it is exciting, and I've got to remember, focus is everything. So right now it's about the food brands, and the extensibility is, it's obvious, it's there, people see it as well. It's like anything we do in a business. It's like start up for what's the minimum viable product, I guess, so to speak. If it was to go to a brand extensibility path, say an immersive experience, I would draw on my current experiences, which is technology, and look at AR and VR, and how does that extend into creating games, for example. I wouldn't do it, but I've got a ton of relationships with media agencies in Australia and in Asia as well. So really, it's about keeping the focus on the food brands and keeping an eye out for the opportunities, but not to detract from setting up the operations and the systems for the brand itself. For the core is food. It will flip into other things, but focus is everything.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think for a business like yourself, you're going to have to adapt, but also have to constantly refer back to what you raised the funds to do, and really just keep on that same road. So we've got another question here, which is from Barbara, who really loves the content and the presentation. And she's got two questions here. And one is around the distribution within APAC in Australia, and what's it looking like in the near future? Are you looking at specific retail channels? You might have touched on this. I might have missed it. Sorry if that's the case. And the second question is, the products are promoted as natural, not organic. Is that right? Was that a consideration? Thank you for the response.
Thanks, Barbara. And thanks, Karen. I've seen some notes coming up from Karen. Barbara, thank you. At distribution level, but right, interestingly, the money's going to be on the major supermarket shelves. That's where the money will be. It takes a little bit of time, and it's a bit of a costly exercise to get onto supermarkets shelves. You've got to have production. You've got to be able to supply them. You've got to have cash flow that can actually support often 45 to 60-day payment terms. And you basically got to do all the marketing to make sure that your product sells. Great. You're ready for all of that. And one person who has expressed interest in this works for Woolworths. He's in the digital and the experience team, knows the buying team. So he's quite keen to get me in front of the buying team. And that's not a commitment or a guarantee at all. But it's interesting that people at a retail level see the brand and see the opportunity. Late last year, I was actually speaking with the Woolies investment fund. So they've got their own fund, which is, I forget the name of it, not X15, W23 is their investment fund. They like the brand. They want to see a bit more evidence before they invest in it. But I will be start at the top always, as much as you can, because I'm not shy, to go out there and start building those sort of relationships. But the likely thing is, and I'll answer this in a few parts, the likely thing is going to be the tier 2 and tier 3 retailers, which was talking about IGA, Foodworks, those sort of organizations, which are less strenuous to get into, and they've still got a really good network. And then tier 3, like in Sydney, we've got Harris Farm. I'm not sure what the equivalent is in Melbourne, but I've just taken on somebody in Melbourne who's going to be heading up sales and distribution. He's got a tea brand, which is a chai tea, doing phenomenal business in Melbourne right now for a pretty early stage company. And he's going to be leading up the sales and distribution efforts. So we've got a database of 2,500 retailers who sell competitor products, and also a distribution list of 130 people. And that's going to be a lot of the effort, is to really hit them up and establish those sort of relationships. And to complete Barbara's question around the product, natural, it is natural. Organic is going to be a big one to commit to right now. And I do want to go down towards the organic path. It's, again, one of the big problems that we're going to face moving into the next few years is around the food supply chain and availability. So I want to make sure that whatever we do, organic's great. And if we can get down to the organic path with ensuring that we've got organic inputs, amazing, we're going to go down there. And natural is good as well, because there's no chemicals or things that you can't pronounce on an ingredient label in any of the products. And that's really important as well.
Yeah, fantastic. And we've actually got another question which has just come in, which is, how do you plan determining which environmental wildlife organizations receive donations? Asking for thoughts basically on shareholders, customers to be involved in the decision, or are you looking to create longer term partnerships with obviously specific organizations that align with the 4 brands that you've created at the Old Saints?
Yeah, awesome. That's great. I think Mick has probably seen my old pitch deck, which was all about creating a separate community of customers who are really active, and from a digital perspective at least, but also shareholders. The idea with the fund was always going to be about bringing people in, if they're interested, of course, to become involved in the fund, to actually start to shape how and what the fund goes to. So to that question around aligning with the 4 brands, having organizations, possibly. I know a couple of people at Panda Labs, which is part of WWF. Great people, very, very much purpose-driven, as you would expect in an organization like that. I like the idea of those sort of partnerships. I also like the idea of supporting smaller organizations who are doing a lot of active work. For example, last year I reached out to Rhino Rescue Project in South Africa. The woman who founded that, her name's Lorinda. She has got this organization, a not-for-profit. Difficult for us to do anything with them right now because of they're in South Africa, we're here. But what I liked about them was that they've got a really clear, measurable approach. So what they do is dye rhino horns with crazy coloured inks and inject a toxin into it that is not harmful to the rhino. What that treatment costs is $600 per rhino, and that basically protects the rhino for about 3 years from being poached, because nobody wants a pink or a blue a toxic rhino horn. And that works because that's reduced in the area that she operates. That's reduced poaching by 92%. And so I really like organizations like that who we can actually measure, saying we've saved 18 rhinos from becoming extinct because of this sort of, those sort of numbers. So I do, Nick, to answer your question, yes, I think the big brands would be great to align with without losing focus on the small organizations that are doing the work.
Yeah, fantastic. And look, that's kind of the end of the questions, and even some of the frequent questions which I had. I was, basically they've all been covered either in the presentation or the questions which are here, which is fantastic. So there's a couple. I'd be happy for us to take a couple more questions, but I'd love to really just summarize the fact that the Alt Saints offer is actually looking to open up next week on Birchal. Charbel is working tirelessly on the offer document while we're kind of closing out final expressions of interest. The company has received an extensive amount of expressions of interest from individuals basically all over the world, actually, which has been remarkable. And we'll be communicating to you, and obviously if you're attending this webinar, I'm very, very confident that you will have been, have already expressed your interest in the campaign on Birchal. Matt, I'm more than happy to send you a link after this, because we've been recording the webinar. I'll send everybody the webinar so they can actually follow up and view it at any point in time after this. But really, you're some of the early stage potential investors, because you'll gain early access to the offer when it does open up next week. But if that's all the questions, then look, I'd absolutely love to round this off and just say it's always a pleasure to have a chat with you, Charbel, and always a pleasure to really talk all things Alt Saints and hear more about the company. So thank you very much.
Amazing. Thank you, everybody, and really appreciate your interest so far.
Yeah,